Better?
Yeah. Good. All right. Thank you. So hopefully this presentation is going to show some pictures of technology that will be the antithesis of getting this to work. What this is about is pursuing beauty with Ruby on Rails. I'm not going to do a whole lot of background information up first here. This is somewhat arrogantly assuming that you guys have at least a vague idea what Ruby on Rails is. And if you don't, we'll take questions afterwards. So, oh, there's even transitions. This presentation is based on thesis of how we went about Rails, how I went about with Rails. And that thesis goes as follows. Beauty leads to happiness. So beauty in this context is beautiful code, beautiful programming, beautiful constructs, and beautiful programs. And the pursuit of beauty in programming, and the pursuit of beauty in API design, and in technology in general is something that leads to happy programmers. That I, as a programmer, enjoy my work more when the output and the journey through all this technology is beautiful. So that places beauty as the centerpiece, the prime objective for what Rails is trying to do. Because if we can get Rails to be in itself beautiful and promote beautiful code, we have paved the way to happiness. And of course, this is not just about having programmers smile while they're doing their work, which in of itself is good, but this is because happiness leads to productivity. If there's one single factor that means the most for how much work you get done, that's motivation. And I'm here equating these two things. That motivation is something that stems from happiness. So if you can create an environment that fosters beauty, you get happiness, and with happiness you get motivation, and thus you get productivity. Thus, beauty leads to productivity. So that's how I arrived at the notion that I didn't want to do PHP anymore. I was unable to write beautiful code. I could not find, I tried for many years to find a way where I in PHP could write beautiful code. And I found in the end that that was simply not possible. And as a result, it was making me miserable as a programmer. So that's how I came to Ruby, because that is the language of all the languages I've looked at that gets me closest to beauty. So this presentation is about showing off that beauty. So what follows is a number of screens full of code, which I consider to be beautiful code. Yeah, just a fancy quote saying, you can recognize truth by its beauty and simplicity. When you get it right, it's obvious that it's right. That's how I felt and feel about API design. It's very much not something you can measure scientifically, which is actually ironic considering the quote. It's something you just know it's right when it's right. And Ruby, again, is the language where I most often get that feeling. That I get the feeling that what I've designed in my application or in my API is right, is exactly how it's supposed to be. So let's start with the first code example here. Showing off a transaction. So this is the model from Rails. I've used something called active record. Account is such a model. It's starting a transaction to do withdrawal from one account and depositing into another account. And what this shows is one of the most powerful features of Ruby, the block. So account transaction do this transaction, it's saying. Do this transaction involving the objects David and Mary. Withdraw 100 from David's account, deposit 100 into Mary's account. And the great thing about these blocks is that they encapsulate a common pattern of start and end, beginning and stopping, or in this case, beginning and committing. Where without blocks and without this way of doing it, you could open a transaction and then either forget to commit it or forget to roll it back, or have something happen in your program that caused it not to do this. In the transaction method on account, we can encapsulate that pattern. Not only that we're doing start the transaction, commit the transaction, but also encapsulate error handling. Encapsulate that if the withdrawal method throws an insufficient funds exception, there'll be exception handling happening inside this block. So that's blocks. But blocks are more of usage case, and what I'll mostly be focusing on here is, this is not very clear. Yeah. Oh, that helps. Oh, now we got atmosphere going. Excellent. Exactly. So what this shows is the first example of something Ruby on Rails is full of, is domain-specific languages. These small snippets of code that appear as if Ruby was designed just for our application. In this case, it's showing how we can encapsulate validation logic inside an account object. And what I really love about this piece of code is that it reads out so beautifully. Account validates presence of subdomain, name, email address, and password. I could show that piece of code to somebody who are not Ruby programmers, and they would understand what's going on. And that level of symmetry between what something does and how you describe that action is, to me, one of the ways to approximate beauty in programming languages, at least. So this piece of code is describing a number of validation rules that will, when you try to save the account, trigger into effect. So for example, validates acceptance of terms of service on create. What that does is that it makes sure the terms of service, which is an attribute on account, is true when we're trying to create a new account. So the onCreate specifies that the terms of service is not something you need to agree on over and over again every time you save an account, just the very first time you create that account. And the validation confirmation of password and email address has the same thing. And what are these actually? Like, it looks like a specification, but what it is actually just Ruby methods with parameters. So account is the class. Inside the compilation of the class, we're calling methods. So validates presence of, that's a method. We're just leaving out the parentheses because Ruby allows us to do that when there's no ambiguity involved. And the first colon subdomain, that's what Ruby calls a simple, which is a single representation of something. So instead of using strings to describe this, we're using simples when they have one programmatically definition. So this subdomain will always refer to the same object. And comma, 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 we're passing more parameters in because validates presence of, and all of these validation methods take as many parameters as you want. The cool thing about this is that this is happening during the compilation phase of account. And as it's compiling account, validates presence of, adds new attributes to account, and actually even adds methods to the account object. So during the compilation of a class in Ruby, you can call new methods that add even more methods. It sounds hard to understand, but when you read it like this, it makes perfect sense. That's validation in Ruby on Rails. And these validation rules tied in nicely into the rest of the framework. So when you're trying to present this model object for editing, you could do the same thing as Adrian was showing in Django. It would show all the error messages, because if you try to save the account without a domain, it would add an arrow to the account saying domain is missing, and you would get that out. So this is about getting a single representation of something like validation. You only describe validation once, and you describe it where it belongs in the model. Next, and this is actually one of the prime pieces and the crown jewels of the active record framework, which is, again, this model representation of database rows. So here you have a project class which dictates a number of associations. So project belongs to portfolio. Okay, project has one, project manager. What we're describing here is one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-many relationships between classes, between tables. But we're describing them in a very succinct way that relies on a large number of conventions. And this is one of the prime pieces of the Ruby on Rails framework, is this notion of convention over configuration. So when project says project belongs to portfolio, it's saying that this project has a one-to-one relationship with a portfolio, and because it's using belongs to, it says that the project owns this relationship, which means that project, the table projects, will have a portfolio underscore ID as a foreign key to map this relationship. And we don't have to describe to project that it's going to use the foreign key portfolio underscore ID, because that's a convention Ruby on Rails is built on, saying if you don't say anything else, I'm going to assume that the association will use a foreign key based on the name of the associated model underscore ID. Has one is like belongs to, but goes the other way around. So that will assume that project manager has a foreign key called project underscore ID, because this is, of course, the project class making that association with project manager, and thus it belongs to project manager to have that foreign key. Has many is similar, saying this project has many milestones, which means that it relates to the milestone object in a one-to-many way, and that milestones will have project underscore ID. So this is the purity, the cleanness you get when your application fits the conventions that Ruby on Rails puts forward, and you don't want to do anything else. If you're doing greenfield development, if you're making a new application, and if you're mentally prepared to accept these conventions as a dictatorship on how you're going to make your application, you can get code that looks as clean as this. Of course, that's not always the case. So it's convention over configuration, not convention always kill configuration. And sometimes you do want to configure these things. And you can. So for example, if the association with project manager, if there's not a project manager class, if that is actually just a role that the person class can play, you can specify a different class name. If the relationship to milestone is a dependent one, meaning that the milestone should not exist in the database if there is no project for them, then you declare it dependent. If your has and belongs to many relationship with categories, use a special join table that the one different than the one Rails would guess for you, you can specify it. So that sums up much of the convention over configuration approach that Ruby on Rails takes. As long as you do what most people would do most of the time, you get to write as little code as is possible to fulfill your decisions. So Rails is trying to optimize on the level of decision making that you care about. So We'll get into that more later, what that means for how much should a framework include, how high level should it be. But this is about the abstraction level that we're trying to achieve in Ruby on Rails. This is a little longer example that even has some show code too. This is something that was actually done fairly recently, and one of those things where I have been doing Ruby for almost 2 years at the time, and when I did this, I sat down and thought once again to myself, God damn it, Ruby rocks. And the reason for this is just account has many people. When you're declaring that account has many people, it actually creates a proxy on account. So you can say account.people. When you say .people, you're getting a reference back to a proxy that will then allow you to access all of these people that belongs to the account. That proxy we can now extend during the compilation phase with new methods. So when the compiler is going through this, it's saying, okay, we have a new account class. It's saying has many people. As soon as we say has many people, it starts adding a bunch of methods to the account class. It's going to add an accessor. It's going to add update methods. It's adding a whole lot of things. And then while that is happening, we're saying, oh, by the way, we have one more thing that it would be nice for you to add on to. So we are combining the dynamicity of these pre-specified, pre-packaged solutions. Has many is such a pre-packaged solution, and then we're decorating it with our own logic. In this case, we're adding a new find method, a find method that'll take a single name, but people don't actually just have names, they have first names and last names. So it'll split that name up into first name and last name, and then it'll call find or create by first name and last name, because first name and last name are actually attributes on people, and it's going to pass in what it split from the single name coming in. So as you can see down in the call, you say person equals account find first. That just means give me the first account in the system. So now we have a reference to that account. Then it's saying .people. All right, now we have a reference to the proxy that's describing this association. And then we're calling find or create by name, Rich and Feynman. And by calling that, like that last method, is that method we declared for ourselves while this proxy was being initialized. And we now have this Richard person, and we can access these attributes. What I so like about this piece of code is how little footwork is there. How little auxiliary code that has nothing to do with my specific method is there. There's basically just a do and the end. There's no fancy monkey business for like how would I get this my own method shoved into the framework's proxies. And I think that's why a lot of people are finding the Ruby on Rails experience so pleasurable, is that at every single step of the way we're just offering you a default ride, and at any point when you need to go off track, you can add your own stuff. So you can add your own methods, you can add your own hooks, you can add your own callbacks. You can do all these things, and they're done in beautiful ways. You don't feel like a criminal for extending the frameworks like you do in a whole lot of frameworks that just have that narrow definition of this is what you're going to do, and if you do anything else, it will be ugly. All right, post. This is another example of how we're just making things work as though you would expect them to work. So a post has many comments, and you can search a comment. And as you see in the search, we've added our own convenience method for search that just wraps up these finders. So it's saying, find all comments where the conditions are as follows. And the conditions are described in that a little bit funny way where it's saying body equals question mark, and then we're passing in the query, and that's to get protection from SQL injection and all those other things. So as long as you're following this way of doing it, you have nothing to fear from SQL injections. All right, so comment has this method, which is fine. I could call that on my own. I could search for first post, and I would get all the first post comments in the system throughout. That's really often not what you want to do. You want to scope your search. And wouldn't it be natural if I said post find one, that is, give me the reference to the first post in the system, then I said dot comments. All right, so now I'm talking about the comments that belongs to that post. Let me search just those comments instead of all the comments in the system. So by declaring this road of access into the domain model, saying I grab hold of some reference somehow. I'm finding some object, and then I'm traveling down the roads of associations, and every step of the way I'm going down, I'll assume that I'm scoped all the way down. So what this basically means is that when you say post find one dot comments dot search, you're doing a scoped search, which is automatically scoped because comments are declared to belong to posts. So you can see the SQL that's being generated is select all from comments, where post ID equals 1. That's the scope coming in. The scope wasn't present in that search method we had. And then say body equals I. This is an example of how we can abstract some of these conventions to a slightly higher level, but still staying underneath the cut. And we'll discuss where the cut actually goes in a little bit. So this story is, like, imagine this as an application for managing an extreme programming project. So these extreme programming projects have iterations and they have stories. Iterations is what you're going to do this week, and stories are like the descriptions of the individual things you're going to do this week. So story belongs to an iteration. All right, fine. So iteration has many stories. Now, these stories are prioritized. So some stories are more important than others, and we're going to work on some of them first. Now, we've summed up the need, the behavior of prioritization into another of these wonderful domain-specific notion called access list. And we're scoping that access list within the iteration. So now let's say a iteration has 10 stories. You can grab hold of any of those stories inside that belongs to the iteration, and you can work with them as the prioritization. So you can grab hold of a story and say move higher, and it'll keep an index of where it is in the hierarchy, and it'll associate that hierarchy with the iteration such that it's scoped. So you can have other iterations that have other stories that are prioritized differently. And each of these domain-specific keywords, like belongs to, is an access list, basically just bundle up a number of methods that it's adding to story, and we're doing that at compilation time, and then we get a whole host of new methods that we can either use during as class methods, or in this example as instance methods. All right, slightly more advanced and involved example. So classic domain example of having multiple authors writing multiple books. In other words, a many-to-many relationship between authors and books. Now, one way to describe this is simply by making, in Rails, has and belongs to many. So author would say has and belongs to many books. But if you're doing that, you're kind of implicitly saying that there is some other model in this domain model that we're not recognizing. That relationship between author and books, we could actually dig that out and make it less anemic, less just a description of association and a part of the domain model. And in this example, we can call that authorship. So an authorship can involve more than just the relationship between an author and a book. It can involve additional attributes. Like in this example, we have how large was the contribution when this authorship was penned, and where was it written. the interesting part here is that instead of just saying we have a many-to-many relationship between authors and books, we're actually saying author has a one-to-many relationship with authorships. So a single author can have multiple authorships. And the same with books. A single book can be involved in multiple authorships. So we're injecting and exposing that join model as a real model in itself. And this is code from yesterday, actually. I just added this to Ruby on Rails, so if you want to try this yourself,
Thanks, I needed it.
you have to get hold of the latest version, the trunk version. So what we're saying here is that we have these, we are making the join model explicit, we're making authorship explicit, but we still want the nicety of being able to say David.books and get all the books that David wrote. And we can still do that because we're declaring yet another relationship that goes through another relationship. So in the code example down here, we're finding first an author, and then we're finding a book, and then we want to create this association. So we create an authorship, and we decorate this authorship with additional attributes. This is typically something that's a real pain to do if you want additional attributes on the join, unless you dig out and make that join model explicit. If you just have a many-to-many join, we actually have that in Ruby on Rails right now, where you can decorate that many-to-many join and you automatically get these attributes, and it's just a huge pain. So this is also an example of how we're trying to educate programmers using Ruby on Rails. Because most programmers, even if they've worked with object orientation for a while, they will get like author, yes, that's something, that's a like domain model, I can take hold of that. Then you have book, yes, I understand these are like physical things. But here we're injecting something like authorship, which is typically something people don't think about as an individual domain model. They just think of, oh, books has many authors. That's how it is, and we don't need to get more clever about that. So what we're trying to do here is decrease the pain of making these has and belongs to many associations by educating programmers of Ruby on Rails in better domain modeling techniques. And this is something that, this is one example of a theme we have going. So another example of that theme is that when you use the generators in Rails to just get started with a new application and you want to make like the new author model, by saying create new author model and getting the stub file for that, you're automatically getting test files that are just stubs, just made out to be ready to put in test cases. And that's saying, well, you're perhaps not used to doing unit testing or functional testing, but let's make it so easy for you that you'll think that perhaps I'll try it on this project. So we're throwing out a bunch of invitations to programmers using Ruby on Rails to become better programmers. And we're throwing out those invitations by making things so easy that it's almost harder not to. It's harder to do the wrong thing. And that was my move from PHP, was centered around that. I finally realized that PHP was the devil. That PHP tempted me at every step of the way to do the wrong thing, to fall into these temptations and just hack something clean or messy together, and I would get something up and then I would regret it in the morning. So Rails is trying to be that angel on your shoulder, saying, no, 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 you actually do want to test from the beginning. Here, I actually made all the test cases for you. You just have to put in your own logic for the test, and then you're testing. So Rails is trying to invite you to do the good deed, which in effect, of course, is also the beautiful deed, because this code is so much more beautiful than trying to shove a contribution and written in attribute onto that many-to-many relationship somehow and have it work. The same thing about testing. you get into very ugly code very quickly if you do not trust your own capacity to make changes to a program without it blowing up. All right, gets even more complicated. This is the most complicated example we'll go through, but I'm particularly proud of this because I also just finished this yesterday. So you have this notion of exposing the join models, saying a many-to-many relationship is actually not a many-to-many relationship, but a one-to-many relationship with a join model that again has a one-to-many relationship with the other object you're trying to associate with. Now, that's all good and well if you know both ends of the association. If you know that books have authors, those are concrete classes, so you know how to create that association. Well, that's not always the case. Sometimes you have tags which will belong to many of something. In other words, they'll belong to many of some interface, or they'll belong to many of some role. And until yesterday, there was no clean way to describe that association has many something. Now, what we can do is we can say a person has many tags through the taggings. So the domain model here is tag, that is something like summer or yesterday or important, all these small single words that you use to describe something to find it again. So you have tags. Then the join model we're exposing, instead of just saying tags has a many-to-many relationship with people, we're saying tag has a one-to-many relationship with taggings. So you apply a tag to something, and that's how you create the association, through a tagging. Now, the great thing about tagging, in this case, because we've exposed the join model, is that we can say it belongs to taggable. But wait a minute, there is no taggable class here. There's person and there's message. So taggable is the interface. Taggable is the abstract notion of something that we want to tag. And we can hereby make a system where a single tag can belong to both a person and a message. And you can find those things again. So in tagging, we're representing this by saying tagging belongs to taggable, but it's polymorphic. I'm still searching for a better word for that. And we're saying in the person class, when the association has many taggings, when I'm involved in that association, I'm posing as a taggable. So taggings will think of me not as person, but as something that can be tagged. And then we have the tag class, which just has a convenience methods of tagging a lot of these taggables at once. Here we again using the block syntax. So we're saying taggables is coming in as an array. We can give as many as we want. We're iterating over each of these taggables, and we're creating a tagging for each of the taggables. So as you can see, we're like, the simple case was tag has many people. Like, that's simpler to understand. That's a simpler domain model, but it's not nearly as flexible. So we're increasing the level of abstraction to keep the beauty when we want to represent something like this. So this is again trying to educate people about stuff like interfaces in order to stay beautiful. So here's the use of this. We find two different classes. First, we find a person, David. We find a message, welcome. And we want to tag both of these with summer. So we'll create a new tag, and then we'll say, apply the summer tag to both David and welcome. So now we can say David.tags, and I'll get summer, welcome.tags, I'll get summer, and most importantly, summer.tagged, and I'll get two different types of objects, David and welcome. And now, to make it even better, I'm pretty proud of the last code screen. Let's go back to that again. making this work without having these things as and through and polymorphic, I was doing that before, and active record and Rails is a pretty succinct framework, but representing this domain is pretty goddamn hard. It takes a whole lot of code. So we boiled it down to just this. We've boiled it down to just these associations we're describing, but of course, like, who would want to write all that twice? So we've boiled it out once again, and this is the representation of that domain model when it's extracted. There's only person, there's only message. Tag and tagging are these generic models, so we don't have to redeclare them. They spring to life, and their associations to them springs to life as soon as we say person acts as taggable. As soon as we've said that, we can say David.tag with summer, tag with something else, and we can then find the summer tag and find these different objects. So going through that tunnel of recognizing first ugly, first how do I represent has many to something and go through an explicit domain model, then boiling it down to the low-level representation that we saw with has many, and then finally boiling it down once more to a single keyword that will represent this whole domain is like a perfect representation of the intense gratification you get with Ruby. That you can take something that is big and ugly and honking, and you can just keep boiling it down until it becomes truth, and until it becomes just this one single representation. And that's just what keeps me in love with Ruby. That you keep discovering how to take away the ugly and make it beautiful. All right, so that's the model part. That's the mapping to the database, and that's usually where a semi-complicated application will spend most of the time, because we've taken, of course, all the pain away from the minutiae of just handling these requests. But this is just one example to show the story controller from the domain with stories and how that will work. So again, as you see at the top, we're declaring these declarative keywords that describe properties around these controllers, and as soon as they're described, they usually change the controller in some ways. They'll add attributes, they'll add methods, they'll change how the controller works. So the first one is saying sessions are great, but we don't need them always. For example, I don't need a session when somebody is just querying their RSS feed. Actually, that's came out of something very real with Basecamp, an application that spawned Ruby on Rails, and I will not go into that story, but we had the problem of seeing tons and tons and tons of sessions created every day. I think 80,000 or something. And we couldn't figure out that, well, we do flatter ourselves, but perhaps we're not that popular, at least at the moment. And the problem was that people were using these RSS readers and had them set to ping every 15 minutes. So every 15 minutes, the RSS reader would connect, and of course saying, I don't have any session, give me another one. And thus a single guy would create like 100 sessions a day by having his RSS reader running. So we needed a way to turn off these sessions to not create files in the file system if you were using that or rows in the database, but we need to like turn it off only for something. So what we're specifying here is an extraction that most of these keywords in Action Controller can use, which is a way of saying only apply this rule to some methods. And feed is then the method that would return the RSS feeds. So we're turning it off just for feed. Verify is a way of saying some methods should only accept certain HTTP verbs, as they're called. So you can only make a post call to comment. You cannot make a get. If you're trying to make a get, you're going to get an error. And then we have the filtering system, which is saying it's a bunch of logic that all actions will have. Like, we have to make sure that people are authenticated before they try to make a new story or before they try to edit an existing story. So before filter authenticate says, before you run any of the actions in the system, call this authenticate method, but of course only if it's new or edit. And this authenticate method then has the power to say, no, you are not authenticated, throw you to a login screen, and not give you access to the original methods. All right, so getting down to something that it actually does. So this story controller needs to be able to show a screen with a story. And the way we're doing it here is, again, a perfect example of convention over configuration. So what are most of these actions in most of the controllers going to do? They're going to fetch something from the database, and then they're going to show some page with it. So let's make a convention saying, by default, an action will be associated with a view called the same as itself. So we'll have show.rhtml, and it'll live in the file system on app/views/story, because this is called the story controller. So that's how we get a namespace for these. So /story/show.rhtml. And if we're not saying anything else and that file exists, we will automatically render that file for you when the action completes. How do we pass something on to this fellow? We just assign it to an instance variable. Anything you assign to an instance variable in an action will be available in the view. So that boils that whole show something from find something in the database, assign it to the view, and render the view down to let's just find something from the database and assign it to an instance variable. Of course, not every method is like that. So new shows a little, whoa, request story. That's an awesome request. I have not heard of that HTTP verb yet. Story. I'm sorry. If it should read if request post ? So if the request coming in to new is a post, we'll say, yes, this guy wants to create a new story. We'll create it in the database. But if it's not a post, that's the else part, he probably wants to create something new. This is a get or this is something else. Anyway, we don't care. We just want to show him the screen where he can create a new story. And in that example, we're explicitly calling render because we want to do something else than the default. The default would just be to render new.html. Now, Rails also has this layout system, which is a way of encapsulating designs such that not every single action template has to include a header and a footer and all these things. And you can control when these layouts are applied by using the render command. So you're saying render layout creation. That's a special layout we're going to use just for the new. But if it is a post, we're going to create the post. We get, as you see, param story. Param story is an entire hash that includes stuff like title and description and all of these things from the view. We just get them as a pre-made hash that we can pass straight on to our model object and saying create. We also set a cookie. It's going to expire 20 years from now. We set a flash, which is just a single communication to the next screen saying show something, a notification that something was created. And then we're going to use the routing system in Rails, which is a way of saying where to go next. Now, Rails has this abstract routing system, which means that you don't actually ever refer directly to /story/something, because that would tie you specifically into like that view of the things. And it would also mean that you would have to do string interpolation every time you would have to do a redirect. So instead we have this abstract system. We can get into that more later. But basically it's saying redirect to action show using the ID of the story we just created. So let's go back to the show command and, of course, showing it after it's created. All right, that's the controller. That's how actions work. Well, how about the views? So this is one example of the views. And I think this is one of the probably major differences to Django and to a whole lot of other frameworks, is that I like Ruby so much that I want to use Ruby everywhere. And we use Ruby everywhere in Ruby on Rails. We use Ruby for the configuration, we use Ruby for the controllers, we use it for the models, and ta-da, we use it for the views. And I can hear people who've been burned badly before by using a real programming language in the view saying, no, you cannot do this. If you do it, the end of the world is coming. People will flood their views with logics and conditions, and it'll be a huge mess, and you'll never recover. No. Because I think the thing that people have to understand is there is no such thing as taking the logic out of a view. The view will always have logic, it will always have loops, it will always have conditions. You just call them something else if that makes you feel good. Because whether you're using Ruby code as in this example, or if you're using special, magical HTML tags that then get replaced by logic, you're still putting logic into a view. And the key realization is that that's not a bad thing. Logic belongs in views because we're making dynamic web applications here, not just these static things. So logic in views, good. Business logic in views, very, very bad. And that's how people got into that whole logic in views suck, because they used PHP, and at the top of their page they had this huge block of code saying, oh, open a connection to the database, now select all from stories, assign them to this array, do some magic on them, and then start doing things. Yes, that is, of course, a terrible, terrible thing to do, and that's, of course, not what we're advocating. We're just advocating that if we're going to have logic anyway, a real programming language, those are usually pretty good at logic, and Ruby is better than most at view logic because A, it's incredibly terse. It's like using Java for view logic is setting yourself up for a good laugh. That would be insane. And of course, people invented template languages that were much, much less painful than the horror that is Java and views. And that was good. That was an appropriate decision to use something else than the abomination when you had to create something succinct, and it was fine. And Python then have other issues with indentation, which means that making a lot of these things can be tricky, and that's also cool. The language made a decision to make indentation count, and that just sucks for views, so you have to do something else. Excellent. That, neither the Java case or the Python case, is a case against a real programming language in a view. And that is the argument we're making with this slide. It's saying, this is actually kind of cool, readable, and we're saying, for example, this is for create a new iteration, and we have just one piece of dynamicity at the top. You already have, and then comes the tricky part. 0 iterations, 1 iteration, 2 iterations. I don't want 1 iterations. That makes me look bad. So we have a method, which is just a method called pluralize. It'll take a count, and it'll then take a word, and it'll then pluralize the word if pluralization is appropriate, and otherwise not. And what you're realizing here is that, wait a minute, where did he put iterations? He only put the singular case in there. You're waiting for it. You're waiting for it. Now, because we had this other convention in Ruby on Rails saying class names are singular, tables are plural. So a project class will have a projects table, and we don't want to say that explicitly. We just want to have it work. And a person will have a people table. We invented this grand system to do pluralization in code. And since that took so much blood and sweat, we thought, damn it, we can use that somewhere else too. And that's exactly what we're doing here. We're calling the quite extensive pluralization, I dare almost call it framework, in Rails, which is a way of saying iteration can be iterations. And that's, of course, boring, because we're just putting an S on there. But person, people, now it gets interesting. Now, you would not believe the discussions we've had in the Ruby community of whether octopus go to octopi, or octopussies, or... Right. So, if your domain model includes octopi, then you perhaps have to say it explicitly. So if you want to pluralize octopus, you have to probably say comma octopi. I think we actually do have the octopus in there. We even have sheep and sheep. We have a pretty long list of funky words in that pluralization framework. But the main case is just, it actually works pretty good. Like pluralization in the English language is kind of a hard problem, but you don't need to solve all of it. You just need to solve those 80% that people use most of the time and then not care about octopi. All right, I got slightly off track there. So the next is kind of the same thing. We're calling truncate. We just want like the beginning of the description for iteration, and we want to truncate at 10 characters and then ... But that's the simple stuff. The really cool stuff comes when you want to create forms. Creating forms by hand is not very dry. Like you have the ID, you have the name, you have the assignment to value, and before you know it, you're repeating the same goddamn thing 5 times. So, for example, if you want to make a text field for the title of an iteration, you have to say title about 4 times if you're doing it in manual HTML. Like, my eyes started hurting the second time I did that. So we're providing a framework for a number of methods for making this easier. So taking that duplication out of it. So we're saying form for this object called iteration. So now when this form is submitted, we'll get params iteration. And it'll have all this turned into a beautiful hash that we can pass straight on to iteration create. Anyway, it's saying, like the normal case, just give me a text field and it'll be, I think, 20 long. That's what we made the default. If you want to make a text area, you can specify a size, and we made that a little bit nice too, so you can say 20 times 40 instead of saying calls equals 20 and rows equals 40. We even have a date selector where you get like these drop downs for the different dates and so on and so forth. And then inside all of this form, we are also creating a new story, like the first story. Create a new iteration and also create the first story. So we have this fields for, which will always also pass on to in the new action. We're going to get both params iteration and params story, and we can create these things both at once at the same time, which is, I thought it was not useful until I had to do it, and then it's incredibly useful. Because like say you're creating a new person object, and he has 5 phone numbers. That's the kind of stuff where it's nifty. We also have like a special method for saying making select boxes. So select difficulty, and we're just giving it the options. That special syntax there is just a shorthand for creating an array with these 3 elements. And then we're linking back, and again you can see we're using that routing framework. So we're saying link to cancel, and instead of saying /something else, we're using the abstract notation where we're just referencing the action. All right. Now, one of the major sales points of Rails since about February has been the, dare I say it, unparalleled support for Ajax. The 2 of the major Ajax JavaScript frameworks, Prototype and Scriptaculars, comes from Ruby on Rails core committers and are integrated exceedingly well in the Rails framework, even though you can use them elsewhere too. And we've been pushing on this for a long time. I think there's this tide coming now where the rest of this year, yes, some people are still going to make applications that don't necessarily have some Ajax in it, and users will start to demand this. Once you've used an Ajax version of some application, going back to the non-Ajax version does not feel pretty. And then you get into a whole set of new problems. Like the web used to be simple. Just a single request, return the whole HTML page again. Nice and clean. Now with Ajax, you're updating small pieces of the page all the time. Update a little bit here, update a little bit there, submit something here, and so on and so forth. So what we've come up with now is a way to programmatically describe all of these objects in Ruby that will result in JavaScript code. Because JavaScript, as we all know, is, horrible. JavaScript by hand without the help of a Ajax framework is pain. And I tried to create, at 37 Signals, we did an application called Ta-Da List. And I did that without an Ajax framework, so I actually had to write all the JavaScript by hand. And I wanted to freaking quit after that if we had to do more of that. Because JavaScript, for some people, it'll fit their brain and they don't mind testing in 15 different browsers every time they change a comma, and that's cool. But for most programmers, they have like an expectation of cause and effect. And that expectation jives very badly with JavaScript by hand. So how do you deal with that? Like, we needed the JavaScript anyway. There's no way to get the Ajax coolness in your web application without the JavaScript. So let's make Ruby make it instead. And that's what this new, it's not really a template language, but it kind of is, like a partial update paging template language. We'll probably abbreviate that into something nicer. But it's called RJS right now. And it's a way to describe, so you have a weblog, somebody submits a new comment, you don't want to refresh the page. You just want to add the comment at the bottom of the comment list, and you want to update a sidebar that says who made the last comment. So you have to make two separate updates to this page. And what you're doing is you're submitting this comment to, let's say, create in the comments controller. And the comments controller then, instead of returning either a whole new piece of HTML or a redirection somewhere else, returns a representation of what needs to be changed. So what you see at the bottom is a representation where page is this thing we're changing. So for example, we're saying page, replace HTML sidebar. That's referencing the div. The HTML div ID is sidebar. So we're replacing that div with a partial. A partial in Rails are these small nuggets of template that you can reuse over and over again. So you'll make a partial for something like a person. Then you can reuse that over and over and over again. It's kind of like includes, but it's also kind of like subroutines because you can pass in local variables to them and do all kinds of funky stuff. And you can also reference them here. So we're saying, give me the new sidebar and put it in there. And then it's also saying, like, have some logic. Like, if this comment is a new record, replace some of this, make a visual effect like you're shaking the input screen. And otherwise, you're just going to hide the comment entry field. You're going to insert that new comment, and you're going to highlight it. So we're actually describing like a whole ton of new concerns you never had to worry about before Ajax. Like, you would just refresh the page and all of this new stuff would be there because like it pulled it all back again. When you're using Ajax, you have to think at a whole new level of granularity. And this is the language for describing that. I think it's pretty cool. All right, so this again is one of those points where we represent the split between what is Rails going to do and what is Rails not going to do. So Adrian was talking about how Django has a RSS and ADAM framework. On the Rails side of things, that's above the cut. The cut for us goes somewhere mystically between infrastructure and business logic. And infrastructure are those atoms that you can put together to mean anything. And business logic are like those atoms put together into molecules that like represent something concrete. Like they represent something special. So what we've done instead of creating like a RSS framework or an atom framework is make it really easy to create XML. And then you can make that XML create RSS, for example. And this is just an example of just how painless it is to create XML with Rails. This is using something called the builder. And the builder is this XML object. So we're saying xml.instruct. That'll give us the first declaration line saying it's UTF-8 and it's using this and this namespace and blah, blah, blah. Then we're creating a new tag by just calling xml.rss. This tag has its version 2 and it's this namespace it's referencing. And then now comes the cool part. We're again using this block. So everything that happens in this block will happen inside a begin RSS tag and RSS tag. Pretty nifty. And then channel, which is also something you have to do in RSS. You're opening that, you're making a title tag, link tags, and blah, blah, blah. That's not the point. The point is this could create anything. This could create Atom. It could create like an iCal format in XML. This could create anything. And what we're working on with Rails is helping you tune the atoms, like not supplying the molecules. And that's the split for us. We don't ever want to include something like an RSS framework or anything else that like right now is a representation of something that's easy. Other people may build that on top, and that's totally cool. But what's going to be in Rails core, this is a good line in the sand. This is what we want to optimize, not above that. One last few slides here on just saying we use Ruby for everything. And this is Ruby for configuration of the framework at startup. So we're saying frameworks, by default, you'll be configured in Rails to have like all the frameworks. Active Record, Action Controller, Action Mailer, Action Web Service. And we're saying this application doesn't need Action Web Service. Please take that out. We're adding some to the load path. We're specifying a log level. We're setting some options on Action Controller. Like we're saying it should use the database for session storage, not the file system. The caching framework that we have should use the file store, not the database. Setting a time zone, blah, blah, blah. This is an example of those routes we were talking about, those routes we were referencing before. So when I'm saying link to action overview, that link to will go down and look into the routes definition and say, oh, let's see, what can we find here? Where will we match? And then it'll turn that match, so like account, a controller account new. If I redirect it to controller account action new, it would redirect in the browser to sign up. So we've split those two apart. So there's the logical representation, which is about controllers, action parameters, and then there's how does this get up looking in the browser. And you can change those things independently without changing anything else, which means that you can change like the entire URL layout of your site without changing any of the link to, form tags, redirects, any of that other stuff, which is nifty. This is again another domain-specific language for an application we have that kind of goes with Rails, which is called Switch Tower, which is a way of pushing your application to a bunch of different servers. And this is just setting up the application called Backpack. There's SVN repository somewhere, and this is the roles you're going to push to. Just again, as an example of using Ruby to represent configuration. Here goes a movie if I was on the Mac. Let's see if we can find it still. So this is almost the end. I don't know how long I've been blabbering. But I just wanted to show this cool little movie from one of the Ruby on Rails core contributors. And, what the fuck? No. Like, this is ugliness. All right. How do I? Oh, I can probably not even full screen.
No, it's not from.
That's yeah. Fuck. All right. Yeah, I designed frameworks, but Windows I'm uncompatible with. All right, so this is just a short fancy video of an application made with a lot of fancy of the new Ajax stuff. It's called Fluxium. It's not something you get at your doctor. It's an application for managing assets. And it's an application that's been built with all of this cool stuff on Rails, and it's made to feel just like a desktop application. And these guys are doing just a tremendous job on making this look and feel exactly like a desktop application, just online, using all the latest. This is the guy behind Scriptaculous, so he knows his way around fancy Ajax. Drag and drop, and it's got all kinds of fancy fates and niceties. And fast cuts. Youthful with the youth. And I'm really looking forward to this. Ruby on Rails, of course, comes out of my work at 37 Signals, where we also create various web applications. We got Basecamp and Backpack, Totalist, and Rightboard, all applications about productivity and collaboration and so on. So this is very much in that vein of things. All right, I think we're just about through here. Now, where do I? Oh yeah, start like the most important button in the system. Like make that as tiny as possible. Hide it alongside a whole bunch of other buttons.
Go back to where you were. Cycle through it. Sorry.
All right. Almost there. There we go. These are actually just a list of topics if I should have run out of things to say. But I think I did not. So that's it. Thanks.